Yeah, warm welcome, everybody. Good morning in Europe and good afternoon in Asia. Today, again, about EU and China's approach to economic security. I'm very happy that we have two distinguished guests here. One is the Professor Weck, also from Frankfurt School, and another is Markus Herrmann from the China Macro Group. I will introduce them before the speech, but again, they are very much familiar with the topic. The procedure of the webinar is like it was before. After my introduction, I will hand over to the first speaker, Professor Weck, and then to the second one, Markus Herrmann. And after the introductory speeches, we go for a Q&A session. Yeah. Please note the Q&A session will be not recorded, but the introduction statement will be recorded, and we will post this later on our webpage. Let me say a few words about the topic. I think we all agree that it's a very important topic, economic security, whether you like it or not, but this is the reality of the world today. At latest, since the Russian invasion in the Ukraine in February 2022, each blocks, let's say, in the world developed a kind of a strategy in economic security. We will concentrate today on the EU and, of course, especially China. Perhaps you know the EU already launched economic security strategy in summer 2023. And with a focus to reduce so-called dependencies on critical commodities. China also, of course, has a strategy in terms of economic security. For example, if you read the 45-year plan launched in 2021, it is stressed very much that economic development is based in economic security, and both goals has to be combined. And for example, China is following a policy of technological self-reliance. Having said that, as an introduction, I hand over now to Professor Weck. He will concentrate on the Euro side, and later on, Markus Herrmann will concentrate on the Chinese side. Let me say some words about the biography of Professor Weck. He's an associate professor for public law regulations and comparative law at Frankfurt School. Before, he was a lead analyst at the Monopolies Commission in Bonn. And there he focused very much on the issues of competition and regulatory law. He also wrote a habilitation then about regulation of innovative financial instruments, risk and object supervisory law. Professor Weck is also a member of the Academy Society for Competition Law and the German University Association. Having said, so I hand over. So Thomas, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Horst, and good morning to everyone. So let's start. We are living in a world of growing geopolitical tensions. The reasons for this are manifold. However, one important reason is that the major economic systems are based on very different economic philosophies. For the EU, the creation of a single market is a core objective. The EU single market is, at least on principle, characterized by free entry and undistorted competition. China, in contrast, is a socialist market economy that is a market economy allowing for significant industrial policy intervention and state influence on companies. These differences have led to two types of challenges for European companies in the past. First, when they invest in China or plan to compete with Chinese companies inside China, the conditions for market entry may favor domestic companies. Second, when Chinese companies invest in Europe or compete with European companies in the EU single market, they may be able to use the financial backing of the Chinese state. Thus, the level playing field in Europe is at risk to some extent. Market participants accepted these challenges as long as the global economy was on a growth trajectory. However, already in early 2019, the main German industry association, BDI, called China both a partner and a systemic rival. This led to first calls for protective measures. Nowadays, China is not the only concern from a European perspective anymore. We experience an increasing alienation also from the United States and perhaps other non-EU economies in general. In this situation, instead of relying on the strengths and adaptability of businesses in the European economy, more and more trust is placed in regulation and state intervention to protect EU domestic industries. The EU institutions have proved very open to calls to protect industrial policy interests in recent years. In June 2023, Horst Löchel already alluded to it, the European Commission concluded a risk analysis and proposed a new economic security strategy resting on 3 pillars. First, protecting Europe from commonly identified economic security risks. Second, promoting European economic competitiveness. And third, partnering with countries with common interests. Among these pillars, the protection pillar is the one where the EU institutions can act most effectively using their own powers. The EU has pursued a two-pronged approach to defend European economic interests in international competition. One prong is that it retaliates more and more robustly against market actions supported by foreign governments. In that respect, the EU makes use of the established anti-dumping and anti-subsidy instruments permitted under WTO law in order to protect the free trade in goods on a reciprocal basis. The EU has also adopted measures to harmonize national investment control. This is relevant in cases where investors from foreign jurisdictions take over companies in the EU whose business is relevant for the public security and order. The EU created an international procurement instrument to make it harder for non-EU bidders to participate in European tenders if no equal access exists for European companies in procurement markets outside the EU. In December 2023, finally, an anti-coercion instrument entered into force. This ACI provides tools to reciprocate in a calibrated manner against economic coercion through tariffs, unfair service conditions or intellectual property rules, and virtually all other measures. This is one prong, based on the reciprocity of how competition is being handled in other jurisdictions. The second prong is that the EU has complemented its toolbox to protect competition within the EU single market against distortions. To that end, it has notably introduced a foreign subsidy instrument. This instrument submits companies receiving non-EU economic support to a form of control which resembles the existing state aid control for subsidies granted by EU member states. Thus, the EU approach towards international competition can be summarized as a form of welcome but approach. In relation to China, this means that the EU is not decoupling completely, but it is definitely aiming for some sort of de-risking. The EU's defensive measures may be justified. They come along with a lot of red tape, however. More controversial still, and questionable, are tendencies to promote strategic political objectives actively and in a way that may be perceived as offensive from the outside. The objective of these EU measures is to reduce critical dependencies and heighten energy reliance, which may again be considered to be a rather defensive interest. However, the EU pursues this interest based on regulatory frameworks that provide for the heavy subsidization of certain strategic industries. Those frameworks are established notably through the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, the European Chips Act, and the Net Zero Industry Act. This subsidization is chiefly not geared towards unlocking long-term growth potentials for European firms, or even towards making the European economy self-reliant. Instead, it is simply meant to facilitate the reorganization and diversification of supply chains and to foster resiliency. This will certainly allow European businesses to continue with minimal disruption amidst global change. However, it is somewhat concerning that these measures have a rather narrow focus and only limited regard to producing a broad and lasting positive impact on the productivity of European industries. As noted before, the last component of EU economic security policy is partnering with countries that share European values and pursue similar interests. The EU has entered into free trade agreements with New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and Vietnam, and into an economic partnership agreement with Japan. The EU is currently negotiating agreements also with India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Thus, the EU is strengthening its ties with important countries surrounding China. Noting all this, it is of course interesting to learn how these developments in Europe are perceived in China and which reactions they may provoke there. With this, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very nice and interesting introduction. I should mention that Thomas Weck is a co-organizer of a conference which will take place on the 6th and 7th June here at Frankfurt School about economic security and market regulation. You're most welcome to register. You will find a registration link on the webpage of the Sino-German Center. Having said that, it's my pleasure to hand over now to Markus Herrmann. He's the co-founder and managing director of the China Macro Group and also the co-author of the report Riskful Thinking, Navigating the Politics of Economic Security, which was recently issued jointly by the Macro Group as well as the European Chamber of Commerce in China. You will find a link to this report on our webpage as well. And before CMG, Markus worked at Government Affairs Director with Bayer Material Science in China and as a management consultant with Boston Consulting Group in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and in Zurich. And Markus is also a strategic advisor Europe to Caixin Global, as well as board member of the Swiss-Chinese Chamber of Commerce. and he holds a BA and a MA in law, focusing on public policy, international public economic and WTO law from the University of Geneva, Bern and Fribourg. So having said that, Markus, a pleasure. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Löchel, for this very kind introduction and for hosting this event. I very much appreciate the opportunity to present the key findings of our report. And I'm also happy to build on what Professor Weck has been introducing very nicely from the European side. I'll share my screen now, and I have budgeted about 20 minutes that I will use to walk everyone through the thinking, focusing on the Chinese side and trying to basically explain how China looks at the question of economic security. Appreciate everyone's time in taking from your busy schedules to join today's discussion. Exactly. So just a visual impression of my colleagues. This is China Macro Group. We're a research-based consultancy focused on China, looking at China through the lens of market, policy, and international affairs, which is a very good lenses for the topic that we're discussing today. The report that Professor Löchel already mentioned, I just wanted to bring it here visually also. It's the same link. You can download it. I'll speak to the portion of this report that focuses on China, but I also want to highlight that there's for those who are interested in the methodology and a lot of the backups and a lot of the examples and case studies for different sectors, because today I'll touch on some sectors, but I will stay mostly conceptual and try to explain how the thinking and the policy thinking works from the Chinese perspective. There's also a background deck that you can download from our website. By virtue of intro, but also a summary, I would like to start with the key goals. So the report was trying to compare de-risking by US, EU, and China. It's already actually a mistake to say de-risking, because de-risking is formally the policy of the EU. The US has basically latched on and used it, at least rhetorically, and China does not speak officially about de-risking. I'll introduce the concept in a moment that China's using that we think equates to basically risk management or economic security. The other goal was to create a calibrated fact base for Chinese risk management, so everyone can engage in the discussion and also identify how businesses are impacted and responding. The methodology, and I would like to stress this, in our bottom-up research, we did not try to find economic or industrial policy measures that in general, but we try to focus solely on those measures that are justified with this explicit security rationale. So it basically, we don't want to mix up development-oriented industrial policymaking with security-oriented industrial policymaking, just to be precise and also to actually have an value added and an add-on into the discussion, and to be able to compare the right things. And then we also conducted some company interviews in China among European subsidiaries. On a high level, the key findings are economic security or risk management is a top-level policy principle since the 14th Five-Year Plan. Professor Löchel was already quoting this background. I will want to make an argument why it's part of actually a broader systemic shift that the 14th Five-Year Plan represents. I'll touch on that during the presentation. And just to mention that top-level policy principle, China's de-risking is basically, in Chinese logic, is to coordinate development and security. I'll come back to this, to both the terms, but also to the concept as well. Then our next main finding is that there's a toolbox with 6 measure types that are being used for risk management. They are not codified in a document, as Professor Weck was explaining for the EU side, like a meso-level type of document. So using principles and then having execution, this is something we actually had to build ourselves, but I'll also speak to this point again. We think overall the impact is comprehensive in potential by virtue of how the measure types are structured and how high level the policy principle is anchored in Chinese policy hierarchy. And then finally, we also see that the security component, there has been a recent toning down in the last 6 months. On a high level, the key impacts on European business, besides business opportunities that are always there, both strategically and tactically, are localization incentives and pressure. Second one is competitive pressure and market distortions in the Chinese market. And then foreign business, European business excluded from certain tech development in the context of risk management, higher compliance costs, and then what I would call networking necessity, because there I'll share one example in Guangzhou. Part of risk management is actually to create supply chain alliances and to drive networking in a very strategic way. So the question for European businesses, are you part of it? So this, just in a nutshell, both introduction but also summary of the main points that I will make in the next 17 minutes now. So the agenda is, I first would like to start on the contextual level, then I will go to the very practical implementation of China's risk management under the 14th Five-Year Plan. And Outlook is just one slide. I just want to explain why I think there is a toning down of the security component in the last 6 months. So if we start, I already alluded to this one. If the Chinese logic is about coordinating Hongzhou, development and security, then I would like to decompose just semantically the different concepts that are at play here. Development, Fazan, it has its own distinct journey. It started in fighting to become basically the basic party line in the end of 70s under Deng. And then it evolved through the scientific outlook on development into the high quality development that basically President Xi added his way of development interests. If you switch to the security side, which is also government interest, Anxuan, it basically evolved itself from single concepts to a holistic view of national security since the 19th Party Congress. And then finally, it took on the shape of coordinating development and security. I'll show you on the next slide the holistic view of national security. But basically, I also want to stress here, if basically you create a policy principle that is called coordinate development and security, and you define that in the middle, development is the guarantee for security and security is the prerequisite of development, you actually de facto, you elevate security to a very high level in the policy hierarchy. And it's inextricably linked. You cannot think about development anymore without security. You can also not think about security without development. And then not a government interest, but unfortunately a reality, there's always risks that can affect both development and security interests. I think these are the main semantic and conceptual components. If risk management in the Chinese logic is about coordinating development and security. So the deliberate choice of foregoing certain development interests in order to strengthen security interests. On the next slide, what I would like to show you, don't need to read the details. This is just a mapping of the holistic security concept, which has 16 components. And it basically started with some that were there already at the creation of the PRC, and then finally to some that have been added in the last 10 years. They include political security, for instance, territorial security, cultural security, biological security, and then they evolved to economic security, deep sea security, and so on. What the report did, in order to basically set the scope for our bottom-up research, was to identify what are the main security interests that actually can have a potential effect on European business interests. And then we prioritized 7 out of these security concepts and basically used them as a filter to identify risk management measures. But basically the totality is these 16 concepts. And if we had been using all the different terms, the toolbox that I will introduce in the second part of this agenda would be more expansive, most likely. Another view on the similar terms is just a view on the count of the terms of both risk perception, perceived risks, but also security interests. Blue is the risks, and then orange is the security interests. This is counted through the lens of 5-year plans, and it is cleaned by terms like safety, because in Chinese it's the same. It's also anquan. And then you will see that basically there has been a constant rise of both since about 3 decades from the 9th 5-year plan. But there's one interesting finding that I will dive into in the next slide that I would like to show, is that there's a disproportionate leap in security interests with an almost steady number of perceived risks from the 13th to the 14th 5-year plan. So basically, it is interesting to zoom in and understand what was happening in the year 2020, the main drafting year of the 14th 5-year plan. What were the main factors at play that actually were driving that disproportionate leap of security interests? Because we will then, as I'll show you in the policy hierarchy, risk management is actually exactly part of that. So if I zoom in into the year 2020, I would argue on the left and on the right side. On the left, I would argue that by 2020, a certain set of contextual factors have been in place. And And then on the right side, these are the main reflections, leadership reflections after the initial containment of the COVID pandemic. Very important factor, of course. It's a very important speech by President Xi, where he was reflecting about strengths and risks to China's economy. If I start briefly on the left side, I think what had been clear by 2020 is that the trade war that started in summer 2018, that geopolitics was there to stay. And this is an explicit articulation at some point in Chinese policymaking to say that US containment and suppression is actually a big threat. This is not a light statement to be made, but it basically surfaced in this period. A second one is that you achieved the goal of creating a moderately prosperous society, which is the first centennial goal. But there is a whole set of further development challenges like productivity, aging, urbanization, factory production liberalization. So a whole set that is basically still there. That's a second contextual factor, I would say. A third one, very important, is that the 19th Party Congress in 2017, so 3 years before 2020, was preparing a lot of the framing that basically enabled in 2020 to then make the 14th Five-Year Plan the strategic shift that I'm arguing. So there was a change of the principal contradiction in society. The 19th Party Congress, the state and issue for China was reframed as the new era, and the high quality development was framed as a solution. Quite an empty shell back in 2019, but it was then gradually filled with policymaking, and then in 2020 a significant step up of more policy, and then also governance factors were in place by 2020. The reflections I was mentioning them briefly that I think are equally important to understand why the 14th Five-Year Plan is such an important shift, and that put actually risk management at such a high priority. I think it was mainly about thinking strongly about what is then actually the strength of China's economy. And one concept that emerged, for instance, was the supersized market advantage as one of the strengths, but also security needs were re-emphasized. And then finally also self-reliance. And self-reliance in its most extreme manifestation is a question of self-circulation, 自我循环, which basically in that very speech was only used for extreme cases. Basically that China's economy, that this type of economy should possess the ability to self-circulate. Taking these factors together, including the reflections, we think, and we also argue in the report, the 14th Five-Year Plan is actually a strategic shift. And I'm just using a quote from Li Junru. He's the former vice president of the Central Party School, 中央党校, where he basically says the core of the 14th Five-Year Plan is to realize the biggest strategic shift since the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee in 1978 and the establishment of a market economy system. So kind of in retrospect, if you're trying to understand how China thinks about economic security, de-risking, risk management, it was actually part of a bigger strategic shift that has a multitude of components that I will now briefly highlight. We think that the main policy answer of this strategic shift is actually in the dual circulation. There's different perceptions of what the dual circulation is. If you are closely reading the policy text and the underlying or inherent concept of dual circulation, there's fundamentally 6 pillars that are part of it. And on this slide, I'll offer you basically the Chinese policy logic and view. And then on the following slide, I'll offer you the same thing, but reframed into a political economy lens, which I think is very accessible analytically. And I think it's also the backdrop of understanding China's economy today. So just briefly on the Chinese policy view, the 6 main pillars are to cultivate comprehensive domestic demand, to coordinate regional and urban rural development, to build a modernized industrial system, which is, by the way, the policy backdrop why China is so focused on the supply side. And it's also part of the perceived perceived overcapacity issue, the way that Europe perceives it. Number 4 is pursuing common prosperity. Number 5, and that's actually the main finding here, China's risk management is at the same high level. One of the 6 main pillars of the dual circulation is to coordinate development and security. So there's no question whether China is doing risk management. It is part of the dual circulation, has been introduced with the 14th Five-Year Plan, and then further is pursuing high-level opening up. That's a Chinese logic of how to look at it. I would like to introduce, and that's my last slide in the context chapter, before I go to the implementation of risk management by the Chinese government. Basically, another lens that you can take is the political economy lens. And we think if you look at the Chinese economy, there's fundamentally 6 structural transitions that are basically taking place in parallel. We think that the first 3 are those that have been launched and have been ongoing since the late 70s, early 80s. And then the 14th Five-Year Plan is actually adding 3 of them. 3 structural transitions. So the first one is economic transition from an agrarian to a service or innovation-based economy. Industrial upgrading is essentially about industrial policy. I think that it's the promote component that Professor Weck was mentioning also, and then market-oriented reforms and market governance. So this is fundamentally the question: if you come from a planned economy, what are the main how and where do you deploy the market as a tool to basically allocate the factors of production in the Chinese economy. The third one is fundamentally about economic globalization. So these are 3 structural transitions that have been ongoing. And then we see the 14th Five-Year Plan is actually adding 3 that are rebalancing or trade-off structural transitions. One is to say that you need to focus on domestic demand and build it as a system. The second one or fifth one is the social rebalancing. So it's something where growth was the overriding paradigm, and it didn't matter which region and who first will be rich. This is now introducing social rebalancing, and then finally economic security. So it's just offering the same conclusion, but with a different analytical framework to conclude. So if I just end on the first contextual chapter, the main point I wanted to convey is if the question is whether and how China is doing risk management, it is part of the dual circulation at the top level. It has been introduced in the 14th Five-Year Plan, and the 14th Five-Year Plan as such is a broader systemic shift in China, is in how China is approaching its political economy. If we now switch into more concrete implementation of what we call risk management, under the 14th Five-Year Plan, I think the first one is just a visual impression. So a quick check across all the ministries under the State Council to see whether the principle of 统筹发展与安全, this coordinated development and security principle has been adopted into the policy making. So all ministries except for the Ministry of Veterans Affairs, we did not see an adoption of that principle, but basically it means that the bureaucracy is acknowledging that policy principle that is hierarchically anyway higher than these different ministries, and they are now empowered and obliged to explore how they can contribute to this principle. Another view, also just visual, between 2020 and 2021. So that this is actually the 2021 March is the enactment of the 14th Five-Year Plan. You see a leap in the numbers of security dominant orientated policies. By a simple count, 2 of the most important policymakers that focused or helped implement security-related policies are the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, and the MIT, the Industrial Informatization Ministry. These are 2 examples. The next slide is, to me, is actually the core where we use our research to establish what is the toolbox. So of China's risk management or economic security. We find fundamentally, if you do the bottom-up research using the 7 security interests that China has, and then you basically collect a long list and then you cluster them. There are 6 measure types that we actually identify. The first one is self-reliance. We would say this is the most prominent one. It's also the most important one strategically. It's about managing import dependencies. And the main measures include fostering SMEs, small, middle-sized enterprise, to fill critical gaps in the supply chain. It's also about warehousing capacities inside China for self-reliance purposes. And then there's also 12 pilot cities that are trying to pilot right now. I'll give you an example in the next slide. How can you get suppliers closer to the OEMs to reduce supply chain risks? And that's involving also these alliances that I was mentioning. A second one is key core tech breakthroughs. China has a semi-official list of 35 bottleneck technologies where China sees too high dependence on foreign inputs, and this is basically an S&T/industrial policy approach in trying to accelerate technology development to reduce the dependency here. Number 3 is securing external supply. This is also about import dependencies, which is actually the earliest measure, and one of the main instruments to implement it is the Belt and Road Initiative. Number 4 is trump cards, as explicitly also mentioned in that speech that I was referring to by President Xi. He basically, this is a way of looking at your mature and leading technologies that you can use in case, and this is a quote, to deter of being artificially cut off of foreign supply. So it's defensively framed in Chinese policy logic to say that we have trump cards and we want to build trump cards to keep other markets dependent on us so we can use the political leverage if needed. Number 5 is sectoral governance. This is mostly about cybersecurity, I think very clearly felt also by foreign business, European business. And the last one is mostly putting in place legal tools to strengthen China's retaliatory capacity. So they have all addressed different scopes. One is about critical industrial inputs. The other one is about tech. Number 3 is about resources. Number 4 is also about tech. Number 5 is also about tech. And number 6 is about foreign influence and pressure. If we now recognize this toolbox, I will just highlight 2 quick examples with the remainder of my time. The first example is if I was presenting this slide in Guangzhou as part of the rollout with the EUCCC report, and I just did a quick check to see whether I can make a concrete example if I am in Guangzhou, whether Guangzhou is doing anything related to risk management. And the example I found then, I could have known it, but I didn't, it was not clear to me in that moment, is that actually Guangzhou is one of those pilot cities where they are piloting to build a supply chain ecosystem pilot program. And the measures include basically building these networks and alliances that I was mentioning, but also identifying like 14 different government officials who lead these task forces, and also 118 leading enterprises as so-called chain leaders that are helping to localize the supply chain in the city or regionally to reduce basically risks. A second quick example I want to give you, and you should only look at the visual in the center. This is the policy logic for SME policy making. There's 3 types of SMEs. There's 4 types actually, but 3 where you find an explicit link to supply chain security and to self-reliance. One is manufacturing champions, little giants, specialized SMEs. So basically, if you're in the box of self-reliance as a measure, actually supporting in a very targeted way SMEs is a key component of it. On my second last slide or last slide in this chapter before closing, I just want to show you that we reviewed then 37 in sectorial 5-year plans, and we checked basically for on the x-axis from the left to the right how many risk management measures were used in one sectorial 5-year plan, and in the y-axis is and what's the commercial ambition? Is it a domestic market development? Is it gaining international market share, or is it about global leadership? And then just by having categorized the risk management types, you can actually then count, and then you will find that 12 of these sectors, they are actually in what we call the hold commanding heights. So you have a very high commercial ambition, and at the same time you use risk management extensively to actually make sure that this will also happen. To give you one example, medical equipment as a sector 5-year plan is using 5 out of the 6 risk management measure types. So it includes addressing bottleneck technologies. It includes also self-reliance measures to support the sector development. And as a contrast, just elderly care at the bottom left, in the bottom left box, no risk management measure and focused on the domestic economy in China. Concluding, I was actually already saying, I think the conclusion that I gave you in the very beginning, if you basically look from the Central Economic Work Conference until today, the signals have been that the balance, coordinate, 统筹, interest, development and security has been undergoing a shift. First of all, the concept has been fine-tuned. There has been debate about whether local government has a clear understanding of what actually security thinking means and whether they know the borders of security. And then finally, Premier Li at the NPC, he was giving let's say a pro-development, pro-economy angle, saying that we need to effectively boost economic vitality while respecting security. So that's why this is the basis for leading me to the conclusion that there is a recalibration of the security interests at this point. So I'll pause here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.